Chairman, it's Helen Snell, meeting producer here. I can confirm that the live stream has commenced.
Right, good morning everybody. Sorry for one or two glitches this morning. It's lovely to have everybody on the call. We've got apologies from Edwina, unfortunately, but Linda has been able to join us, which is great. We've also had apologies from John Kerno, but I think Glenn and I will be arranging to catch up with him. But John is our government sponsor, member of the deaf team, so we'll pick up that. And I can hear a horrible echo, so hopefully that's only me and not nobody else. Somebody's got the microphone. I can't hear laughing, which we definitely don't have laughing on that board, so there's something else. Welcome also. We've got Josie back, Josie Goff back, who she went off on a world tour, but she's now back and is on the call. We've also welcomed Julian, who was sitting in, I think for at least some of the meeting, maybe not all of it. We've got Phil Mason on the line as well, and we've got Malcolm's joining us for a section a little earlier in the agenda around the recovery. So I don't think there's anything sensitive until that point. So I think Helen's been through comprehensively how we do these things. My chat box doesn't always work very well, so please use the raising hand thing, and I can ignore that as well. Please got my permission to shout. So again, thank you everybody for coming on. We've had a few declarations of interest. Is there anything else that we need to note ahead of the meeting? People have seen the agenda. Francis?
Thank you, Chair. Please can I declare an interest in all things Smart Islands related?
Yep.
Please? Thank you.
Okay. I can't see anything else. So I think at the moment we've got a substantive issue in section 2, which we need to debate. But I think we'll work through the agenda. If there are things which start to feel uncomfortable in terms of declaration and interest, I will shout. Can I ask that we go through the minutes of the last board? If we can just, I'll just bring it up on my system as well. If we can just go through that page by page, and Glenn, if there's any actions as resulting from that, if you can comment on those as we go through. So it does seem a lifetime ago with COVID, but so page 3 of my my pack. This is multitasking. Page 4. Page 5. And final page 6. I think the issues in the meetings in the minutes we'll be picking up as we go through. It's been an awful lot happening, so unless anybody disagrees with that, we'll take those as noted.
Chair, it's Emma Code from Democratic Services. Just for transparency, could I ask board directors to raise their hands if they are in favour of those minutes?
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. I can confirm that they have been carried.
Lovely. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, just a quick update for me. The quite a rich pack in terms of pack notes, in terms of the amount of stuff that's been happening. I know we've been meeting informally, but before we start the meeting, I just want to thank all members of the boards. I think have been very busy aside from the formal meetings, but there's a few I just want to reference. Who've done a colossal amount of work aside from our formal board meeting. So Steve, on the flow agenda, you'll notice the reference to floating offshore wind progressing in the Strength in Places Fund, but the whole flow agenda, but also the whole energy agenda. So it's great to see Benham, and it's great to see lithium starting to get sort of national coverage. So thank you, Steve. Claire's been running our rural subgroup and has been doing some really excellent work trying to define what we need to do in terms of those, particularly the agri-food sector, what we need to be doing going forward. So thank you for that. Emmy, as ever, every time we speak to anybody in your sector, they always say, "Oh, I've spoken to Emmy." So thank you again for everything on that. John and Louis, John with the Cloister Fund, but also the investment panel will refer later on to some of the work they've done aside from it to help one of our tricky issues. And I know Francis has been really busy, and we'll have to find time to have a quick update on the Employment Skills Board reshaping. And I know for one, I'm really excited the calibre of people and better people we've got on that board, coming from employer groups, and just within the interview process, some of the ideas and thoughts are excellent. So thank you everybody for all of that. We have been working, as we said, outside of the formal meetings, and in some respects we've done a huge amount outside of the formal meetings, but I think we are, as a LEP, very close to the issues about what's happening at the moment. I think we have successfully got an alignment of all our business groups, and we've got reach out to regular conversations with many of those groups on a weekly basis, many that we wouldn't normally talk to. So I think we are very tuned into what's happening out there, and that is also now starting to shape two things. One is the morphing the LIS work into a recovery paper, and also working with council colleagues around what should go into any devolution deals to make sure we can bring more local decision making, more local. We have enclosed the statistics pack. It went out, I think, before the Rishi Sunak announcements, but I think the view, and we'll pick this up no doubt, Glenn and Malcolm later on, but I think the view is that the announcements last week were welcome in terms of cash flow going into next year for businesses, but the employment cliff edge that we fear we're facing at the back end of this year, I think will still happen. So we are still expecting there to be a significant increase in people seeking work, and we know there's going to be issues around locations. We know there's going to be issues around age groups. So we're also concerned that some of our institutions with COVID are tight for money and are struggling. There's been an awful lot around the spaceport, and I just want to note that there is a pressure on our space budgets to make sure we don't lose the airport infrastructure, and that's something the business cell that we've been talking to every week have been anxious to not lose the airport, but equally anxious not to lose the space opportunity as well, and we'll pick that up later on. And I think the other thing we've got to bear in mind is we are starting to see, as everybody knows, the beginnings of a second wave, and now as well over the last few weeks the focus is firmly on what could happen with Brexit, especially in the food fishing sectors, but most of our business groups are talking about uncertainty about what their markets are going to look like, the cost of serving those markets, longer supply chains, and this comes at a time when their cash and probably energy reserves are at their lowest. So I think we do generally fear, for all sorts of reasons, that Brexit will also be disruptive. So it is really important that we do get very clear in terms of what we expect in our list. Behind all that as well, we'll probably allude to devolution. We traditionally have been really keen on supporting the council bringing decision making on structural funds or things like adult skills near to Cornwall, so we can make best use of them, align them, and that will be a theme over future meetings. And also there's a lot of debate at the moment about where Cornwall sits in the sort of larger regional group. So we have been supporting an all-party parliamentary group. We've been talking to them about Great South West. We note some of the conversations around that South West region should be maybe linked to the Western Gateway and even South Wales. But from our point of view, we need to make sure that Cornwall's voice is amplified and not lost in the going of that. But that's certainly an ongoing process at the moment, which we'll talk an awful lot about. So unfortunately, I think the tone is fairly gloomy. There's an awful lot of things to be very concerned and frightened about. But there are some success stories which we will hear going through it. And I think our role is to reiterate in these times is to make sure whatever resources we can get our hands on are effectively aligned to the local industrial strategy as we test that and it becomes a recovery paper. that we do everything we can do to support people back into work and getting their skills ready. So there's been some good work happen over the summer to make sure what resources that can be deployed are being deployed. Maybe not as fast as we hoped, but they are now being deployed, and that's good. But I think reshaping the Employment Skills Board has never been more timely to make sure that we do everything we possibly can do. We would very much, as I say, like to support the local decision making. We've seen through European monies when we've got some devolution and some wriggle room that we can make best use of that. And we have got to keep talking very loudly about what's happening in Cornwall, not only on the impact of COVID, which we believe will be one of the hardest hit areas, but the whole issue around rural and cost recovery. But also we have got some truly transformational things which we all know coming through, and we've got to make sure that in this really loud, complicated political landscape that people hear the voice of Cornwall. So we might have to be a little bit pragmatic. So sorry, it's a little bit gloomy. It doesn't feel a little bit. We'll cover a lot of those things in more detail in the first part of the meeting. We will have a little break then, and then the confidential part we will address the issues raised in our annual review, some of our governance structures, and it's important really that we do bring that to a conclusion, because I think the workloads on the LEP and all of us associated with it are only going to go one way, and we want to make sure that we give some clarity to the exec and clarity to Josie and our colleagues about the progress we're doing against the governance challenge that we've been set. So I think that's everything from me, and I say just thank everybody again, because the amount of work that people have put in over this time has been colossal, and it is much appreciated. But Glenn, can I pass over to yourselves, and if anybody's got any, I've noticed a couple of hands, I think they're old ones, but if they are old ones, if just drop them. If not, we'll move on. I think it's old one. Okay, Glenn, over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. So I was going to kind of split my first two items into two, really. The first being the CEO's report and an update on organisational challenges during COVID, and also an update on the kind of business as usual issues, and then perhaps talk about what the LEP has been doing with our partners to support businesses and Cornwall and Nails of Scilly during the pandemic and the lockdown, during the next item on recovery and where we might go from there. So in terms of the CEO report, it's quite a full CEO report. I'm conscious that whilst we have been having informal meetings and we have had formal meetings on specific issues, we haven't had a formal board meeting, certainly not in this format, since lockdown began. So I was going to take the opportunity just perhaps to do a quick review of where we are across a number of areas, particularly governance, strategy and delivery, and any issues coming out of that, and then take questions if that's okay with you, Chair. So in terms of COVID, the first thing I wanted to do was to say a very big thank you to the staff team who've adapted really quickly and really well to working from home, different working patterns, and also quite a big increase in workload to address some of the challenges of COVID and the lockdown and the resultant economic crisis that the LEP has been asked to lead on. And also to the board, who've also been a huge source of support and guidance around their own particular issues, but also generally to myself and the team. And also just to take a moment to thank Mark, who has done a huge amount of work chairing the business response cell and now the recovery cell as we move into that phase of recovery. So just wanted to start with that. So thank you, everyone. In terms of the CEO report, I'll take some of the items in the order that they're written. So in terms of governance, it's worth noting that whilst in lockdown, we have taken the opportunity to move to a slightly different pattern of board meetings, slightly fewer formal board meetings, but much more informal board meetings. And we're going to trial that for a period of 12 months to see if that improves our governance and is more efficient. It's certainly been helpful to me and the team in the first few weeks and months of trialling that. But the subcommittees of the board have been really busy carrying on their work. The audit committee, the noms committee, the investment committee in particular have been meeting quite regularly. Just want to reflect on some of the work the noms committee have been doing, particularly around employment and skills board recruitment, which Mark mentioned, and we're in the final stages of making appointments to the board, but that process has been really successful in reaching a much broader spectrum of experience and voices in Cornwall, so we look forward to making those announcements soon. Noms committee also been doing a huge amount of succession planning and forward planning, in particular thinking about how we replace board members and particular skill sets that we've lost over the last 6 months. So we will be going out to recruit for a board member in the autumn, particularly looking for someone with the kind of audit, risk, finance skills that Louise Rowe had, who has now left to start her maternity leave. But we're also thinking about this time, sadly, this time next year, when Mark will be stepping down at the end of his second term as chair. So we're beginning to put some thought into what that recruitment for a replacement looks like, when we will start that, and the kind, reflecting on the kind of skills and experience that we need. So there's been quite a lot of succession planning being done by the nominations committee, and we'll bring that back in detail to the next board meeting probably. Just an overall perspective on organisational performance. So what you will see in these papers and reflected in the finance and the risk sections is that, of course, the COVID pandemic has been very challenging for a number of businesses, but as an organisation, we have managed to adapt quite quickly. And as I say, move to different ways of working, both in governance and operationally. But when you look through the finance report, what you will see, and some of the delivery report, what you will see is a slowdown in spend on some of those projects that we were scheduled to do at the beginning of the year. That doesn't mean we haven't been doing anything, and actually it's partly a reflection of the fact that our small staff team has been focusing on things like the Getting Building Fund, things like the leading the business cell, supporting our local authority partners in things like discretionary grant awards, and generally shifting our focus from some of those business as usual issues to responding to COVID. That has had an impact, and board members will see that and note that in terms of spend on some projects and delivery of some projects. So the papers in front of you highlight that. I think what will happen is that there will be a pickup in some of those areas of spend as we get back to a more business as usual format. We're certainly not expecting any of those projects to stop that were in the delivery plan, but there has been varying degrees of spend. It might be a scenario that some of that spend doesn't happen this year and it gets carried over next year. It's a bit early to tell, but we are planning to ramp up and catch up on those things, hopefully as the lockdown eases, but we wait and see obviously with that. In terms of risk, probably and the risk register, which is attached in full, just a note that the audit and assurance committee have been looking at risk quite carefully, particularly the COVID risks over the past few months. There's two I'll probably draw your attention to. One is obviously the COVID risk. You might be surprised to see that it is currently sitting at amber, and we thought long and hard about that. But in terms of reflecting on where we are as an organisation, we have already made some of the changes that will put us in a good place should there be a second spike. You can only kind of shift to working from home and different government arrangements once. So whilst the risk of COVID, as you'll see in the register, is increasing along with the kind of R rate and the count of new cases, we feel reasonably well prepared, and that's why that's sitting at an amber at the moment. But we are looking at that carefully, and particularly our systems and our staff and how that might be impacted in the future. There's also a red risk around government policy, and that's about a number of things really. That's about the expected devolution and recovery white paper in the autumn. We don't know yet what that is going to say, but as Mark has alluded to, it's possible it will make some conclusions around some of the partnerships we've been working in Great South West. For instance, it's possible that it will say something, we hope positive, and I think there are opportunities in this as well, but around how shared prosperity fund and devolution will work in the future. So definitely opportunities to be seized, but we're flagging it as a risk because we don't know the detail of some of that. And also we haven't had government confirmation of funding yet for LEPs next year. It was quite late this year and didn't come till April. We haven't had any confirmation to next year. So we're still running that as a red risk and drawing that to the board's attention. In terms of strategy, just moving on slightly in terms of the report, huge amount of progress was made just before and during the initial stages of the lockdown with the local industrial strategy. That's now been endorsed by the board, but also both our local authority partners, and has been really well received in terms of conversations I've had with businesses, the private sector, our broader partners, and certainly from government partners as well, government departments, government agencies. Might be something we ask Josie to comment on later, but in the way that we had anticipated that the local industrial strategy would now go through a process of government approval and endorsement, I'm not sure, given current priorities, that that's going to happen, and we wait for future guidance on that. Having said that, we're using it as our strategy. It's been adopted by the board. I think it's a really good piece of work. We clearly need to look at it through the lens of COVID, and I'll speak to that a bit later on. But a really good piece of work, and also like to record my thanks to Caroline Carroll, who did that work and has now gone back to her substantive role at Cornwall Council, but just noting the good work she did on all of that. Also in the strategy section, I mentioned Shared Prosperity Fund. We are still making the case for a significant Shared Prosperity Fund, the equivalent of what we would have had within the European programme, and making the case that local partners, councils, LEPs, private sector can deliver that more efficiently with a much more comprehensive approach to devolution and decision making. We did submit a broad proposal as part of the comprehensive spending review consultation, because we think it's worth keeping government aware of our views and reminding them of commitments on that. We have had positive comments by our MPs and the Prime Minister, and we're hoping that that will come along soon, and we hope that that will form a part of the funds that we can jointly invest in the recovery. And then just a quick reflection on delivery. So delivery we'll talk to in a bit more detail in part 2 under the update from the Investment and Oversight Committee. But I think broadly there is a very positive picture here. So our growth deal programme is on target. We continue to monitor the impact of COVID, particularly on construction projects, particularly linked to supply chains, but certainly the contracts we have entered into recently, thinking about Porthlevin Harbour, Foul Fish, we're seeing those projects go forward reasonably to time, reasonably to schedule. There is always the risk of delays linked to COVID, but as a programme, and a significant programme, all of that at the moment is reasonably in budget and reasonably to time and delivering the outputs we would expect it to do. We have signed the final contract within that. So as a LEP, our entire growth deal programme is committed and in a delivery phase despite COVID. The investment fund, board members may want to comment on this, but really pleased to see that the investment fund, which John Acornley chairs the steering group of, has continued to make investments during COVID, and again is on target in terms of its spend profile, and has begun to invest in some of the startup businesses that I think as a LEP we would like to see it invested in, particularly thinking about tech startup and new companies operating kind of in the borders of creative industries, tech. So it does seem that the British Business Bank not only maintained quite a strong pipeline, but also reflecting our new local industrial strategy and the awards they make. Also like just to say a very brief word about Growth Hub, and Nathan might like to comment on this. Growth Hub has really been at the forefront of COVID and business support, and has taken a huge amount of calls over the past few months. It's been asked to do some tricky things, advising businesses around the impact of COVID, running the Kickstarter program that we hope will be uplifted in terms of budget, because there's been huge demand for that over the past few weeks, and has generally done everything we've asked of it as a frontline resource to engage with businesses both proactively and reactively. So I think there's been a huge amount of work undertaken in difficult circumstances. Chair, I think I'll leave my run through there and take any questions, but I think as an organisation we have adapted quite well, and I think everyone's played their part in that, so thanks again.
So have people got any questions or comments? Francis?
The mute has worked, we're fine.
Well done.
Yeah, it's always iffy on Teams. I just think, given the stats that are in the papers later on and the high levels of unemployment that we're anticipating, and the amount that we in the Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly are going to be affected by not only COVID but the impending Brexit crisis and the financial crisis that is undoubtedly going to follow, certainly with the COVID. I'm just not sure that we've accurately reflected that in the risk register. I know that it's a fast moving piece at the moment, but I just kind of think with my ESB hat and my Priority One Access Group hat, we've got the makings of things that can make a resolution to help maybe resolve. And I know the work that the People Hub have done has been phenomenal, but I'm just not sure we're accurately recording that in the risk register. And if I was looking at this from the outside, I'd think, well, they haven't really got any problems with people and jobs.
Okay, Francis, thank you. Let me take that up as an action how we do that. We do have our weekly call with the business cell, and I just put in the chat box, through them we've got the British Business Bank on the call every week. We've also got the CBI, which I know isn't very well represented in Cornwall, but it is nationally. So I think we have, the truth of it is, I think we are very much informed about what's happening, but the point you make about that not necessarily being reflected in the risk register and maybe the review process, and you're aware that certainly the world changed a little bit with Rishi Sunak's announcements last week. So but maybe if I can just ask that Glenn and I take that up as an action in terms of maybe given the extreme circumstances, how often we ask the audit team to review that risk register. Louis, you got your hand up.
Yeah, just to say I chaired the management board of the Growth and Skills Hub yesterday, and just to pick up on Glenn's comments really about their performance, and I really feel they are an exemplar. It's a real success story, and they've done a fantastic job. Had some really positive feedback from the likes of the Federation of Small Business, and just I've heard secondhand just what a positive and vital lifeline they have been to so many businesses. And I just sometimes think the Growth Hub doesn't quite get the recognition at perhaps this level, for the good work it does. So yeah, just really emphasising that.
Yeah. Thanks, Louis. I will certainly pass that on. We have a call every Monday that Stuart is on, and through Stuart, the People Hub as well, which I know is always very rich input from him on that. And I know it is hugely appreciated, but in the middle of all the crocodiles, we probably don't stop every now and again and say thank you. And certainly when we hear comparisons to other regions, I think we can be very proud of what we've done down here. Apologies if I don't take everybody's hands in order. I know Tim's is up, so Tim.
Thank you, Mark. Glenn, I just wondered if you could perhaps update us a little bit more on shared prosperity. we were obviously, and the papers show we were expecting some announcements. We were told by ministers that would be this autumn. But obviously, with COVID coming back, there's been a delay to the budget, etc. Do you think that the delay helps or hinders our case for a meaningful settlement? And have you got any sense of when are the government saying to you when they think this might be clarified? And my other final question is, are you hearing anything from government on what they think the role of LEPs will be for shared prosperity? Thank you.
Nathan?
Thanks, Tim. It's a difficult one to second guess, and Josie might be a more appropriate voice on government policy for this one. I think what I would say is that we're certainly hearing a lot more about Shared Prosperity Fund from government. We did speak to Simon Clarke when he came down for his visit, and it was clearly in his mind. Now, the minister's moved on since then, but I notice in the new minister's list of duties and responsibilities, high up on that list is Shared Prosperity Fund. So it feels to me that it's coming up the agenda. Government have clearly, it is clearly delayed and has been delayed as a piece of policy development before COVID, but undoubtedly has been delayed further because of that. But I think the fact that there has been such a severe economic impact, and I'll come on and talk about that in a minute, has focused government's minds on the recovery. So I do get a genuine sense that Shared Prosperity Fund has gone up the agenda. I'm hopeful it will be part of thinking coming out of the devolution and recovery white paper in the autumn. If it does, we're very well prepared. We've done a lot of work on both in terms of the strategy, the local industrial strategy, and we always wanted to do an accelerated piece of strategy work, so we were in this position, so it would guide Shared Prosperity Fund when it was announced. But we've also done a huge amount of work and continue to do a huge amount of work on what a delivery mechanism might look like and how we could speed up delivery, make more decisions that are shaped to the local economy. So we feel really well prepared for that conversation. The extent to which it will be accelerated and rushed through, I think is probably a question for Josie, but certainly people are talking about it much more as part of the recovery now.
Yeah, Tim put in the chat box, and certainly I was in the room when Simon Clarke was happy to put on record that we would be part of the statements being made this autumn, but no longer in post. So we'll see. Josie, I know it's a tricky one, but can you shed any light?
Well, I'm not sure I can shed any light, but I can give you the kind of official / unofficial line. The devolution paper, white paper, is still sort of touted to be an autumn publication. With the change of ministers, that is not an imminent publication, so we're not talking about weeks. So, my honest sense is that I feel the definition of autumn could be quite broadly stretched. And certainly there are media reports that we're talking 2021. Now we're not saying that, we're still saying autumn, but probably quite a broad definition of autumn. But what I would say is that the previous drafts that I've seen do recognise Cornwall, do recognise the individual status of Cornwall and its historic identity. We're doing our best to retain that, and we are strongly supportive of where shared prosperity fits within that devolution white paper, and how that all fits in with the wider sort of move to mayoral combined authorities. What we need to just wait to see now is the extent of the government's ambition in terms of what the appetite is in terms of how far this goes. So we have a stronger position to know more in the next couple of weeks, and I'll be sharing that with Glenn and the others.
If I may, could I please just ask about the LEP role? I beg your pardon, Mark. Josie, is there any clarity on that, do you think?
Not at this stage, no. What I would say is I think that the way the LEPs have responded through the COVID pandemic has been absolutely exemplary, not just Cornwall's LEP, but across the piece. Government have recognised that the LEPs have been the best place to go to get things like getting building fund and other investment priorities out quickly. And I think that has probably really helped the narrative for LEPs. So there's no future policy at this stage, but I certainly think that narrative is now swayed in the favour of that representative business voice.
Okay, thanks, Josie. Thanks, Tim. I'll bring Glenn in a second. Just add a couple of things. We had a call, I think it was last week or end of the week before, with following up the all-party parliamentary group. There was a follow-up call with some of the lead MPs from there, not from Cornwall, but they were still talking about it being the devolution paper being an autumn, as Josie said, fairly stretched autumn, but they were still expecting it. And from our point of view, there's a lot of conversations going. Clearly, Shared Prosperity Fund, size of delivery, control, being able to align different funds is core to us. There's also quite an ever more important ask around adult skills to face into what's happening both on the downside, on the upside. But there's also a number of specific bits of work being done around some of our key things in our industrial strategy, be it energy or tourism. So this is very much work in progress, and a lot of it happening very quickly to get ready, because we want to make sure that we respond or influence the response to the devolution paper as critically as we can do. And we also signal to government the direction of travel that Cornwall needs to take in the future around its economic recovery. So people will be aware of conversations happening to that effect. Glenn, can I bring you in?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. The one thing I was going to say that I forgot to say in response to Tim was whatever the outcome of the conversation around Western Gateway as opposed to Great Southwest, which hopefully will reach a conclusion with government soon, our position on Shared Prosperity Fund and decision making and devolution about that has been and continues to be that those decisions around spending of economic programmes are best made at the functional economic area level, which is Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. So there is no question that we have been arguing for those decisions to be made locally.
As well in this section, I appreciate we've got a little bit of time, but the other big thing that's happening, which we alluded to at the beginning, was certainly the floating offshore wind Trends and Places Fund. So I don't know if Steve just can give a very, very quick summary of where we are, because that's something that is happening in parallel to some of our other projects.
Yeah, we're working on those as we speak, Mark. So where we've got to is just to remind everybody, we were successful in an EOI bid into Strength in Places. The Strength in Places is place focused and it's technology neutral. So we've got regions such as Glasgow which are bidding in for glass manufacture, and it's a very, very broad brush. I think this is the first success for the Southwest, and I think it's the first success in offshore renewables, although we've got a long way to go. So what we've now got is we're working halfway through the project, got people next door working on it as we speak, and it's a £64 million project. It would include £34 million worth of government support from UKRI. The key partners at the moment are the region is Cornwall and Plymouth City, and the reason for that logic is that those are disadvantaged areas. The partners are 5. It's being led by Wave Hub, although will probably be renamed by the time we submit the bid. AMP at Falmouth are a partner. Universities of Exeter, Tremo and Plymouth are partners, and last but not least the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult. The bid is 6-phased with a number of areas. It includes skills, includes offshore works to actually accelerate the consenting process. It includes investment, for example, there could be a capital investment in Falmouth and in the enterprise zone in Falmouth. That includes things like the creation of an offshore renewable energy business school. Again, that could be on the enterprise zone. The bid is to be in on the 25th of November. If successful, we'll hear in March next year, and the work would start in this in the middle of next year. It will be a 4-year bid, three substantive years of 6 months startup, 6 month close down. But the primary focus is to be in a position to build out large-scale floating offshore wind farms in the southwest approaches from 2025 onwards. That would be, we're talking somewhere, the idea is to be allowed us to get between 2.5 and 3 gigawatts worth of potential building from 2025 onwards, and the sorts of inward investment required for that would be in the order of 10 to 12.5 billion. So it's a big deal. We're I wouldn't say we're overconfident, but we're conscious, and it's not unhelpful that we're the only offshore renewables bid to get in so far, and we're only the only one in the southwest bid to get in so far. So to a certain extent, it's ours to lose, but there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes to actually make sure that it's a really strong bid. And I'd certainly be happy to update people in due course as the bid's shaped up and we start to socialise it with key players.
Thanks, Steve. So I'll bring this section to a conclusion, but just to say this, there is a huge amount of really substantive things happening at the moment, which could be very material to the recovery and the sort of transformation of our part of the world. So in terms of our meeting etiquette, I think where the meetings are formal and informal meetings, I'd absolutely like to continue. And clearly, if stuff happens, we'll need to change that. But there's some very big agenda items live at the moment, and very difficult to pick out exactly where they're going to conclude. And Steve's is clearly transformational, but it is a competitive bid. So if ever you speak to anybody of influence, please make reference to our energy ambitions. Glenn, can I hand over to, we call that a day for that part of it, and hand over to you and Malcolm for the next section, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So I will attempt to share my screen. So the way I was going to do this is do a brief run through some of the broad economic impacts and trends that we're seeing, some of the activity that the LEP have led on with our partners during COVID, some thoughts on what comes next, and then hand over to Malcolm, because I know board members were particularly keen to think about tourism as one of the most impacted and sectors, and one that's been locked down for the longest. So I will, between us, we'll try and get through that quite quickly, because I think a discussion and questions are important. But we have been working closely with Malcolm, so hopefully the slides will join up reasonably well. I will just try and share my screen. Can you see that, Mark?
Yeah, that's come up. Thanks, Dan.
Okay, so the first thing I was going to say, just picking up Francis's point about risk, is that from an executive point of view, and I think from the private sector point of view more generally, we are under no illusion about the economic impact of the crisis, and we're seeing that both in the economic data at a business level, but also an individual level, where universal credit claimants is increasing, GDP is decreasing over the period of the COVID lockdown, and we've also done some modelling, which I'll come to in a bit. But we're also seeing both the importance of some of the government schemes, particularly the furlough scheme, through some of the numbers that I've just put on the screen, which is the number of jobs supported through the furlough scheme across Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, but also quite a significant reliance on those schemes, which does create risk, as Francis was saying, going into the autumn and winter. So this is slightly retrospective data, but at its peak there were 84,000 jobs in Cornwall supported through the job retention scheme, and as that closes and morphs into other things, that does create risk, which I'm sure Malcolm will pick up on later, and does highlight the impact of COVID on businesses. So when you look at that in a national comparison, there's very high take-up in Cornwall and Scilly. So a strong reliance on those schemes. 37% at its peak of eligible employments. So nearly 40% of those employed. And we're certainly in the top quarter of regions that are reliant on those schemes. Same for self-employment. 77% take up in self-employment, and that reflects our economic structure, SME-based but micro-based economy, and large proportion of self-employed. And just a reflection on some of the grant schemes that were delivered locally through the local authorities gives you a sense of the scale of the amount of funding from government which has been invested in the local economy, but also the flip side of that, the need. So well over £200 million invested through the various business support grants across the patch, with a particular focus on coastal and market towns who have been feeling the impacts because of their focus on retail, because of their reliance on tourism more than some areas. And just a note on where we think some of the economic data and economic forecasts might go from here. So this is based on a bespoke piece of work done by South West Councils, modelling the likely economic impact in terms of GVA, with three scenarios, an upside scenario, a baseline scenario, and a downside scenario. And I think it's worth noting that the upside, which is the red line, even on a positive interpretation of where the economy is likely to go from here, and this is Cornwall, not the Isles of Scilly, but just Cornwall, just to be clear, we won't see a return to pre-COVID levels of GVA until 2025. On a downside interpretation, which may include further lockdowns, we see a much worse graph, which will result in significant job losses. So I think we know that businesses have been hard hit, and there is the potential for that to be worse in the long term. But of course, we wait to see how the pandemic plays out and the resultant lockdowns, if they come, how that will impact on the economy. In terms of the LEP's role in, first of all, the emergency response, but then more recently the recovery, we have been leading the business cell, which was established to work with the private sector, bring public sector partners together, and generally lead on intelligence gathering, working with government and sharing intelligence on what was working, what wasn't working, and where the real pressure points were, but also working with partners to inform things like the creation of the furlough scheme, certainly lobbying for more flexibility in the furlough scheme, working with partners in Visit Cornwall to do things like produce the tourism recovery plan. We've also, I won't read through all of these, but we've also done a lot of work in repurposing ESIF funding, particularly European Social Fund, and accelerating getting calls out, which will hopefully, with the anticipated increase in redundancies, support people through reskilling, retraining, and particularly young people from the labour market. So that is going through a kind of tendering call process at the moment, but we have worked with partners, A, to get that call out very quickly, and B, to reshape it to be responsive to Cornwall and Scilly's own needs. I'll come back to that maybe in a bit. In terms of our own responsibilities, as we've talked about, we did work really hard with government colleagues to get the Getting Building Fund over the line, and the map there shows the investments that have been made, and we are working, perhaps to talk about this in a bit more detail in part two, but we are working with those companies to get the kind of offer into contracted programme state, and we've had further guidance from that from government this week. I put the Enterprise Zone Growth Fund on there because one of the things we did very early on in the crisis is repurpose the Enterprise Zone Growth Fund, which I think was the right thing to do. So we essentially took a proportion of the funding that was sat in the Enterprise Zone Growth Fund to do proactive things on the Enterprise Zone, but broadened our policy around how we could use that in order to support our COVID emergency response. And what we've done with that is try to make strategic investments in supporting our partner organisations, particularly those that have a membership structure that are involved in directly supporting businesses. So we have made investments into Visit Cornwall. We've played a key role in liaising, supporting, lobbying for the tourism sector. The same with the Chamber of Commerce and also the Cornwall Marine Network. So we have redeployed that fund in a different way than was anticipated. But I think that speaks to how quickly we've reacted and tried to put our limited financial support that we're able to do as a LEP into supporting the business community, which I think is the right thing to do. Some of those other things I've already mentioned, but we also brought forward the operational start of the People Hub as a one-stop shop point of contact for people affected by redundancy. I'll leave Malcolm to talk about tourism recovery in a moment. Just a reflection of our local industrial strategy, Liz on a page, which we have used as our guiding principle throughout all of this. What we intend to do in terms of the local industrial strategy, as I was saying earlier, we had a moment where we were about to submit it to government. We've paused that, waiting for government guidance. But the next step for us was to turn our Liz into a implementation plan. So much more detail about the type of investments, the type of projects, the type of programs we would like to see, perhaps through Shared Prosperity Fund and other programs, in order to see it delivered. I think what we will do at this point is do a review of that strategy through the eyes of COVID, and then produce a recovery plan. So our Liz implementation plan will merge into a recovery plan. So we will see what things we can bring forward, what trends the crisis has accelerated, particularly around things like people's behaviour, the impact on towns and place, and reflect that in a list of implementation projects. We had tried to recruit, so noting what I said about Caroline going back to her substantive post, we had tried to recruit earlier in the month for a recovery manager to manage that process, but we've decided not to appoint. So Nathan and I are thinking about the most appropriate way to bring some additional resource in to drive that forward. But we are certainly also wanting to repurpose the local industrial strategy task and finish group. We think that's the best group, chaired by Mark Goodwin, to do a kind of COVID reflection on the strategy and then begin to think about some of those projects. So we'll make sure that board members through that group are engaged in the recovery plan process and bring it back to the board at a later stage. Also been working with the LEP network on their national 5-point plan for recovery. And as is set out in the report, they've been talking about a number of things that they would like to see LEPs do, but government acknowledge as well. And you'll see in there particularly a focus on green growth initiatives, which is at the heart of our Liz. And we've already seen us practically implement some of that through the Getting Building Fund with our support for a retrofit programme and lithium. So we are working with our LEP partners nationally as well as locally. And we're also going through a process of aligning our local activity within those 5 sections. So all this slide is showing us is how we are beginning to match those national LEP priorities with our local work programme as a starter for 10 on some of the things we will do and accelerate as part of a recovery programme. Happy to talk about that in in more detail. And then just a note, as I said at the beginning, this is our delivery plan priorities before all of this started on a page. And the things in bold are the kind of additional areas that we are working on as a result of COVID. So there are, 6 or 7 very significant pieces of work that we weren't doing that we're now accelerating and prioritizing through this process. So I guess this is just a reflection of some of the things I said earlier about we only have a certain amount of capacity. We are focusing on the COVID response, which is the right thing to do, but that may impact on some of the other things we're doing as an organisation. And that was it. That was all I was going to cover. As I say, Chair, we have been working very closely with Malcolm on a recovery plan. So I was going to hand over him to talk about some of the issues specifically around tourism that we've been working on.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. If you could take over, Malcolm. And I was just wondering after this section, Francis, maybe just a couple of thoughts on what's happening with the Scillies. But Malcolm, do you want to start the debate off, please?
Yes, I will. I'm just hopefully sharing the screen. Has that come up correctly? Attempting. Has the presentation come up?
No.
Share tray. Just trying to look at it. There's a little arrow that says open share tray. Is that the one? I'm not so familiar with Teams.
Yeah, that should work, Malcolm. If not, it might be possible for Carol to put it on screen and do it that way.
Help, Carol. I could sing a Neil Sedaka song.
No, please don't.
Bear with me, I'll just try and share my screen.
Is it worthwhile where
I could start
with the technology just to start to describe?
Yeah, I was going to say, well, I think the first thing before I was going to start the presentation is a big thank you. If it wasn't for the support from the LEP, I would be sitting here today with one other closing Visit Cornwall down for the end of the month, because that's where we were in March, because like every other business, that's when we get our revenue in. We obviously lost some sponsorship from GWR for now, and membership was the biggest issue. And as I said, when we looked at cash flow and the need to make sure that that we could honour all our commitments, especially to the members, to keep the website going, we would have had to close at the end of October. So now we're okay through to December and more likely March, to be honest. And then let's see what happens in the new year. So that's where we are. Secondly, a big thank you for the LEP for being engaged in the wider economy group and the rural group. And that's been very effective, and also working with Elsa, Scilly and Nick and Nicola out there. And also, when I'm on the thanks, the Growth Hub, but also Cornwall Public Protection. I think across the piece, and I think the LEP has been a conductor of this, there's been a bringing together of information that was consistent and agencies working together to have a common message across. So that's the thanks. What it's enabled us to do is actually deliver an awful lot of advice and guidance to businesses. We've had webinars with over 250 businesses on. Even the one this afternoon has got over 50 because people are still looking for advice. Newsletters going out now once a week, but more often. A lot of businesses really engaging in it. It's not just our members. We opened everything up to every business that wanted it. We've actually got the best working relationship we've had with associations, and we're looking to develop a joint integrated membership scheme with associations. So not only has it been powerful in terms of working together, I think it will put us on a very good platform going together. I think the major thing that kept going was the website. For those who don't know, Visit Cornwall is the 3rd biggest tourism website in England, only beaten by Visit Britain, if you count that as England, and Visit London, and it's the 6th biggest in the country. And during up to the summer, that web traffic was 50% down, hardly any surprise. I've just done the analytics this morning because it's ramping up in September. A lot of people looking for next year. And year on year, since the beginning of January, we're actually only 4% behind on web traffic. So that gives an indication that the sector can bounce back, given if COVID gives it a chance. Carol, can you move on to the next slide? Thanks. Just a quick thing of what I'm going to cover, impacts on it, impacts to date, and leading through to the ask from government. But we'll move first on to the next slide, Carol. What we've looked at is trying to project forward when the losses turn around into sort of not break-even point, but clawing our way back up. Obviously losing, most of March, because March wasn't a good month anyway. April, May and June was around a £750 million loss. August, July was probably a slight increase in that loss. July was. August was probably just under a par. September has been a stonkingly good month, but it's obviously half the size of August. And it was, and still hopefully is looking okay for stronger Octobers and Novembers. And also looking at that interest was sort of profiled in that if the virus allowed, that means local lockdowns and lots of issues, and this is looking less likely, I have to say, best case scenario. You are talking around May, June next year to actually start to get back. Now, it will still take another year to really recoup, but that gives you a sort of idea of where the industry will be. Also gives an idea of where one of the challenges will be in cash flow. Next slide, Carol. Most likely scenario is that we will have reduced business because of COVID, and that means that that sort of change in business is projected to shove that coming head above the water piece again into July and August. And the next slide, Carol. Thank you. This one's a more worrying one, that if we do have a very flat October, more November, December, particularly December with Christmas, and then January and February with half terms, the worst case scenario, which I think is probably unlikely, so somewhere between the projected scenario and maybe the worst case scenario at the moment, you can see that that could actually push it into a position where the industry are facing 4 winters. I'll come back to that on which sectors are being hit on the next slide. Carol, next slide. I've tried to actually split down where it is. I think the first thing to say is the one thing on our numbers, looking at the projections of traffic and car parks, and more importantly, occupancy rates, we were probably right in projecting Visit Cornwall in the staying visitors. I think what we underestimated was day visitors, with lots of people on furlough, lots of people working flexibly, and also actually particularly from August and September onwards, lots of visiting friends and relatives, is that day visitor numbers were stronger. That's quite good for some businesses, if you put beach cafes in there, stuff like that, but not so good for other businesses, and probably they are obviously lower spenders. So where we are as hotels, you can see it there, higher costs, but with the business rates, civils and bibbles and all sorts of things, and furlough, you know, they're higher costs but happy because they were facing Armageddon, and now they're all working on how they get through the winter. So that doesn't mean they won't be making redundancies. I think most will be making quite a lot of redundancies. Holiday parks, they weren't able to operate because of bars, entertainment or whatever, so a lot of higher cost and reduced income. So they're not in the best position, but some of them got good borrowing capacity to hopefully get them through. Camping, yeah, they were happy. Higher costs on cleaning, but happy. Motorhomes, you'll probably see a lot more of those. That's been the boom sale, and that's a challenge for us, particularly working with Cornwall Council on motorhomes. B&Bs did pick up. They've dried up business recently, but again, most people have doubled their cleaning costs because everybody's very serious on that, but they're okay for now. Self-catering, again, happy in the green. higher costs but happy. Attractions, very challenging. Some attractions fine. Places like Flambards have been 70% down. People like Paradise Park with animals to feed. Reduced numbers really is hitting those. And we've already heard the response from the National Trust and Eden on redundancies. Activity providers, lower income, but most survive because they're normally quite micro businesses. Coach and tours in real danger, overseas tours in danger, and obviously business and events, which aren't huge, but they do supplement a lot of the hotel and other apartments. So staring where we were in June, one could say we've actually done well, but doing well doesn't mean doing brilliantly. So moving on to the next slide. The big issues from the scenarios is cash. Cash is king, the old adage. Turnover is vanity, profit sanity, and cash is king. Working with people like Tom Roach at Francis Clark, and also, trying to factor in the Chancellor's changes all helps, but we could still have lots of cash flow issues, which was made very clear to the Tourism Minister in his visit, with requests that there might be more time to pay and more time to pay for deferrals. And we will be publicising from Cornwall Council that if people are worried about business rates next year, to talk to them early. But cash flow will be the issue, and I'll come back to that one. The problem with cash is, especially for smaller businesses that aren't used to handling these situations, is we're starting to hear it now that they're getting very slow in paying suppliers, particularly this time of year where maybe they won't need so much in the future. Some are delaying a lot of investment and refurbishments. That's particularly the holiday park sector and the attractions and new developments. But I'm also, obviously there's also laying off a lot more permanent staff. I think what we will see over the next month is people who've worked for businesses for many years being laid off and made redundant. And to give you an idea of where that ripple effect might be, there's about 53,000 jobs, about 43,000 full-time equivalents in tourism and the induced sector. And the induced sector is often retail and distribution of food supplies. But also that I'll give you the full figures, 19% of business spend is normally retail and 20% on food and drink. So we're not just talking the core hospitality sector here, we are talking about the supply chain as well. There are exceptions. You'll probably see that Watergate Bay are looking to develop in the old 15 restaurant, and there have been others that are in a positive cash position and more importantly can borrow, but are looking to make the most of this. So medium long-term position for the sector is very positive. Some businesses are in difficulty that might be bought out and changed, but the challenge really is to support the viable businesses through until the recovery. Next slide. Support to date. I mean, the main thing that we needed is advice, information and guidance. And again, thanks to Public Protection and the Growth Hub, as well as ourselves. The things that have worked really well is obviously the business rates holiday. Furlough was a lifesaver. I don't know why I put SEC grants, that must have been something different, but the grants, the council managed grants, VAT and tax deferrals, and bounce back loans in particular for the smaller businesses. That actually has helped protect them in cash for now, but many are in a worse cash position than they were this time last year. And obviously the VAT reduction really helped, and most of all reopening on the 4th of July. If we'd lost July, we would have been in a totally different position. Not been useful for some. Civils, mainly for a lot of businesses, were not really there. For some businesses, actually, they refinanced with their banks. They didn't actually, when they went for a civil, they ended up refinancing. Useful to certain businesses, eat out to help out. I think we know the argument there about long time of year and some of the issues. And the discretionary and kickstart grants have been very useful. The only reason they're not really welcome is because of the limited funding and the discussions around the use of those discretionary grants. They're incredibly effective tools. The issue is that not everybody's been able to access it who maybe should have been rewarded or given those grants. Next slide. I'll try to speed through to get the questions. What's the lessons? from the summer, because it's important that we reflect back. I mean, the first thing is, which might surprise people, we actually had 2 million visitors approximately between 4th of July and now, and very limited any tangible identification of the virus being transmitted. So it has proven that visitor economy and the virus certainly could operate effectively in the better months weather-wise. I have to say that every Wednesday when I got the figures, it was like getting your exam results. It was a white knuckle ride to see if something would happen. But I think I would say this now it was projected, but not brave enough to say. A lot of the businesses did an awful lot to avoid any problems, particularly in the accommodation sector. Everyone was a bit paranoid to be named the first business with a COVID problem. So that was there. And a lot of our visitors, in fact, the vast majority come from the suburbs and slightly better and very better paid jobs. So they're probably the least likely, although we did have our issues. As I said, far more day visitors, far more new visitors and younger visitors we've had. And there's a lot of visitor management issues we need to look at, about issues around litter, issues around certain crowding points, issues around illegal parking. And those are ones I think we've got to look at over the winter, working with partners to see how we tackle that. And also, push again for the compulsory registration of all accommodation. And this is not a go at Airbnb. There's some excellent players in Airbnb, but we're really blind to know where the accommodation was and where it's growing. And also a bit of a worry, if I might honestly say, that we'll get a burst of accommodation only operating in July and August from new purchases for second homes and the like. So I think we do need to have that, at least intelligence of how much accommodation in the traditional and the new platforms there is, so that at least we can monitor that situation. Since 2005, 15 years ago, I wrote it is about value, not volume, and i.e. gaining more for the area from tourism with less pain. It's certainly one thing we need to really revisit and work out post-COVID what that means, which comes on to the last one. I think now there is a real need of a new direction. It would be a change of direction, not a massive change of direction, particularly building up, obviously, on the cultural heritage, transport sectors, the whole sustainability agenda and green tourism. And really the emerging thing about high value experiential tourism. It's all about the experience. It's all about sight doing, not sightseeing in the jargon. So moving on about what we're going to be doing at Visit Cornwall. We managed to get access. Visit Cornwall applied on behalf of the wider region, and we worked with Devon on the delivery. We postponed our Enjoy Summer Safely to September, but we still had to use the word summer, even though the campaign ran into mid-September, but luckily the weather still shone. We will be working with the Escape the Everyday campaign with Visit England in particular, and soon to launch our, and we're just gaining the data, 50 things you can do every day, which will run from October till April, mainly on digital and social media. But it's a way of trying to get across, particularly for the elderly market or the older market, people with my grey hair and a bit older, that actually you probably haven't holidayed this year because you wouldn't go on a plane and you didn't want to come down here when it was busy. Well, there are plenty of things to do in the winter, and that will be theming on Made in Cornwall Mondays, all the produce and products and arts and crafts even made here in Cornwall. Arts and Culture Tuesday, Wake Up Wednesdays, which is sort of get up and go out and experience some things, mainly walking. Thursdays should be down there is Find Our Past, about histories, the museum, and finishing off with Foodie Fridays. The idea is not that you don't have to stick to those days to doing it. Obviously you don't. It's just that there's a whole new range of things you can do all through the winter, especially as we've lost festivals and events such as Padstow. Moving on quickly, because I realise I'm probably waffling too long. Only one more slide now. I think the big challenge, and we had this discussion with the wider economy group, is a lot of businesses, and particularly bearing in mind that the vast majority of businesses, despite what the trolls keep accusing me of, are local businesses. 80+% of farmers rely on tourism to a certain degree. Most of our hotels, B&Bs, small camping sites, self-caterers still actually owned by local people. Yes, we do have the second homes, we do have the travel lodges, and we do have the big holiday parks, but they're local businesses, most of them small businesses, and they really do need a bit of help with things like cash flow planning, debt management, even one-to-one support, some financing, mentoring, because at the moment they've been so busy trying to make money that the next panic will be, how do I now survive through till next April and beyond? And also, you know, even things of negotiating leases and the like. Also about, I think more important, equally importantly, is actually for some, particularly maybe attractions, is how do you change or pivot your business, and how do you look at the future markets that maybe people have struggled with in terms of getting engaged with. And that is around sustainable cultural tourism in those areas. With regard to government asks, I mean, the job support scheme does need to be beefed up if we're going to save jobs in the key core workers. The deferrals would help if they were pushed back a bit more. I know we're always asking, but I hope, particularly as the cultural sector opens up, and maybe the push the seat out to help out, and a couple of extra ones are the rule of 6 as soon as possible to take children out of that, particularly if they're half term. Might be going light and dark here. And also there are a number of businesses that are still left hanging out there, furnished holiday lettings, some self-employed, that could have been helped with discretionary grants, but we weren't allowed to. So there's still a list. I think you ask the government are getting less, and it's more about extending what they've done on a sectoral basis. And I will shut up at this point. And
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Malcolm. That was really helpful. Certainly, two things. I know Linda's going to come in, but I might ask Emmy, Gordon, Francis, Claire, their perspectives from their particular industry sets. But that issue around hand-holding financial support will keep us. We're going to keep on the business side, because a lot of the businesses have never been in this position before. So how do can we collectively work a little harder to be the first put, you know, to that initial help to make sure people can do everything they can do to support their cash. But Linda, do you want to come in first, and then if the others are happy to come in, if they want to just flag up and wave their arms. Linda.
Thank you, Chair. Malcolm, good morning. Nice to see you again. I hope you're well.
I am, even though it's looking a bit dark on my screen. I'm well.
Yeah, okay. Two things, Malcolm. Really good presentation. Thank you very much. The 50 things to do every day with the launch in October. Have you actually got a date for that launch?
12th of October.
12th, lovely, thank you very much. And the other thing, Malcolm, is that most businesses, restaurants really welcome, you know, having all these extra visitors. But is there anything we can do to promote the book it? You know, to help businesses manage their staffing requirements, you know, the bills for what food they need to get in. This seems to be quite important to help manage expectations.
I think you're right, and I think one of the things I hope to continue, particularly attractions have enjoyed it, is actually the booking ahead has actually helped futile visits and overcrowded visits. So I think you're right. We are looking at a booking engine for a lower commission rate for activities and attractions and accommodation. We haven't looked yet at one on the food and drink sector.
Thank you, Malcolm. I think that would be really, really useful if you were going to be able to pursue that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mute. Thanks, Linda. Emmy and Gordon. Emmy, do you want to go first?
Hi, yeah, thank you. Yeah, great presentation, Malcolm. It's really interesting to note that point that you were making about the increase in day visitors and what that actually means in terms of what you described as visitor management issues, and we might want to describe as kind of impacts on the environment. And I suppose I had a couple of things to say, which is really welcome the sort of trailer for the opportunity that we have to be real leaders in terms of sustainable regenerative tourism. I think, you know, as a LEP, we really need to put our focus on that and think about what that actually means for communities and the role that businesses can play in making sure that Cornwall shows some real leadership in that area. And from a sort of museum attractions perspective and the kind of intel that I have from my day job at Cornwall Museums Partnership, I think there's some interesting and perhaps slightly unanticipated effects of COVID. The booking system, pre-booking, is actually having some positive results in that it's meaning we're seeing less drop-off on the sunnier days. So that actually is a useful mechanism for us to retain. Museums were generally basing their predictions at the beginning of coming out of lockdown on about 30% capacity. Actually, we're seeing that's closer to 60% in some places, and a higher spend per head in the shops, which is really interesting. I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but that's interesting to note. And I suppose the other thing, just to pick up on in terms of your sight doing and not sightseeing, which I really like, and I wonder whether there's a way that we can turn the sight doing into actually positive net gain for the environment. What kind of activities might people be doing that actually put something back in terms of some of the activity that we've seen over the summer that's been less desirable? It's that thing about hotspots for culture and heritage, which is the same as you know about with the kind of coastal villages and the places, and how can we flag up the places that people aren't going to, because actually with the reduced capacity that coronavirus brings to our cultural attractions, some of them are now fully booked for quite a long time. So there's a bit of smart thinking about how we send people to the places that are slightly not on the radar, and maybe manage visitors in that way. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emmy. That's really helpful. Gordon.
Thanks, Mark. Great points from Emmy and an excellent presentation from Malcolm. I do appreciate it. Just actually on that last point that Emmy made, Malcolm, I'm sure you're aware of the data duopoly team working at Falmouth Launchpad on an app that can direct tourists to places that are less used, and that might be an interesting test case for them. A specific one from me about VAT. We've been banging on in the sector for years about the need for the reduced rate of VAT on tourism. Great that we got it. I'm interested to see that your view is that it is having a significant effect. I think the challenge now is to hang on to that, and I'm be interested in your thoughts, Malcolm, about what the sector is doing nationally to retain the reduced rate, what we at the LEP should be doing to support that, and just make a point, actually, a potential ally that we've not really been able to work with so much in the past would be Central London tourism, because that's where I am now, and if there's anywhere that's really still struggling in tourism, it's Central London. It's not remotely back to normal. It's sort of like the aftermath of one of the terrorist outrages that's going on for absolutely ages. People simply aren't going to hospitality or tourism in London. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
I think right. Every time I talk to Bristol, London and Manchester, they're very jealous of where we are, actually, which is unusual. On the VAT, I think the challenge that, and it was good that it was announced an extension, because when it came, a lot of bookings were already in, and the Treasury and the DCMS were quite content in a way, content's not the right word, but not upset if people used it to boost their cash position. So that first sort of month or two of VAT was more a boost to businesses' cash position, which didn't help the argument. I think what you're seeing now in the autumn, and the great news are going through to March, is the market will now kick in and the consumer will now feel the benefit. And it was always the argument that if you reduce VAT, you stack them high, you sell a few more, and therefore the tax loss isn't as bad as they go. So I think the real challenge now working with others is to say, can we discount the first couple of months of when the VAT count and do an analysis of what it's meant on spend in hospitality businesses from now to the end of March?
Yeah.
Because the first thing was it, and the tourism minister admitted it, they were quite happy for it to help the cash position of businesses. So it wasn't really a test. So that's where we're going to work with others, is to say, test it from October through till March as a test of what the effect of cutting VAT does have.
Certainly the minister was indicating that the net effect of all those things was clearly an active work stream, wasn't it? What that would do going forward. So we've got to keep pushing on it. I'm a little bit conscious of time. Francis, I don't mind the sillies. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to what you're seeing over there, and I don't know if Claire wants to say anything around the rural economy, and then we might have to try to wrap up at that point. But Brian.
Yeah, just a couple of quick points. Thank you for the very interesting presentation, Malcolm, and from comments from colleagues. Picking up the value, not volume, I think that's a really salient point. As a council, we're trying to strengthen links with Island Partnership and work with everyone to try and extend the season. Bookings are looking extremely good for next year, which is very gratifying. But the main pivotal point, I think, for most of our small businesses is the cash flow issue that Malcolm mentioned, absolutely pivotal. And of course, at a very small level for many of our small businesses, they transferred many of the bookings, especially at the beginning of season, to next year, and obviously transferred the deposits, and well, not so much transferred them as kept them. And I'm afraid most of those deposits have been spent to actually sustain the business at the moment, which does mean as we move into the winter, there are probably many challenges, as we all know, ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Fran. If I could just get some,
because when people talk about bookings being strong in the spring, probably 2/3 of them are bounce bookings from this year.
Yeah. So thanks, sorry, Mark. I'm sorry for being rude. If Claire, any comments, and then Tim, and then we'll wrap up and move on. But Claire first.
Yeah. Thank you, Malcolm. That was excellent, and thank you for all the support and help you've given businesses. You know, not just your membership, but businesses generally. You know, Visit Cornwall has been the place to go to get advice, you know, within the industry, which has been great. Everyone's known that, and it's been a really good source of information. I think just going on from what Emmy said, I think we are absolute, and from what you put at the end of your presentation, we are absolutely at the point where we need to be looking at a strategy for tourism going forward, and a sort of sustainable, regenerative tourism. And I would really like to sort of urge the LEP to take that on and move that forward, to bring in all partners. So the sort of food and drink, and as you said, you know, agriculture and farming businesses that have tourism as a source of income going forward, heritage, how we look at transport moving forward, and actually come up with a strategy that then local initiatives can work under, and really have a sort of vision and a name for tourism in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly that is different and you know, breaks the mould, and how we can look at, you know, I mean, what you were saying about value, not volume. Absolutely. But looking at all what we're doing with all our sort of businesses moving forward, our green tourism, business tourism, you know, what we're doing with geothermal, offshore wind, all of that is a sort of way of encouraging people to come down here and see how we do things differently down here. So I think, you know, I would really urge, you know, the LEP to put some funds, if they have any, towards doing this, and actually come up with, you know, a sustainable tourism strategy now. And, you know, I think we really should get on with that and use this as a great opportunity to change our tourism. So that was it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. I couldn't agree more about we need to hold as many hands as we can do, influence as many people to keep the cash flowing over the winter and spring. But boy, do we need to define what it is we really want. And we're a little way off that. Tim.
Yes, apologies, Mark. For just one thing I'd like to mention is to return to the refresh of the SIP in terms of the recovery plan. If I can request again that the LEP really looks hard at its role on town centres. I know it doesn't lead on this, however, town centres in Cornwall, more than 20 significant towns, are going to be the focus of the economic challenges ahead. And I know there are reasons historically why LEPs didn't do town centres, but I don't think that's going to apply much longer. And I suspect government in shared prosperity will be talking about the town centre and place-based regeneration. The trick for us on the LEP, I guess, is how do we connect up the sector approach with town centres? And I'll give one example. In other parts of the country, they put innovation centres on high streets. I'm not saying we're building anymore, but you know, rather than out of town A30 type places. So where we can, please, can we do everything we can to connect the priority sector investments with town centre locations, and that way people working in enterprise zones, etc., will wander into the town centre. Currently, many of these places are not in those sustainable locations, which we can't change, but in the future we could. And just to have a sense of the scale of this, I'm with colleagues in the council currently working on what is at least a £100 million programme for 4 towns. That's the town deals. If you add on the 25 million Penzance will hopefully get from High Street Fund, that's 125 million. Now that's more money than a whole year of any of the European funding programmes just for 4 towns. Now if we compare that with the amount we all looked at on the accelerator, or the 13.5 million discretionary grant spend, it's huge. So I feel we need urgently to refresh the SIP to connect what we, the LEP, do with what we, the council, is leading on, and certainly what businesses say is a massive priority. And Glenn, I know it's in the SIP to some extent, but I think if we're honest, it's not exactly prominent. And I think a refresh is a great opportunity. And the table you showed us earlier did not have a bold piece of text mentioning it. And I'd like to request that you at least consider doing that. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thanks, Tim. That's a point well made. And I agree. I think the other thing we've probably just got to pay heed to is a lot of the people that make up this part of our industry are many and varied and incredibly hard to reach as well. So the other part of this is how do we bring all those people and support to it. It's probably the other end of the scale of working with AMP about the floating offshore wind opportunity. This is hard to reach. I will finish there. I just want to say thank you to Malcolm, but also on the line we've got Julian and everybody on the call really. If you hark back to where we were a few months ago and the difficult conversations and the tensions that we're having around Cornwall and the Scillies in terms of welcoming back visitors, but the fact that we actually got through that and we did welcome them back. I know there were issues, and we're in a slightly better place, even though it's pretty grim than we thought we're going to be, and we haven't seen the spike that we feared. Then I think it's testimony to a lot of hard work. So I think we should just reflect that. I think when we had this conversation back along, we probably didn't anticipate being here. So from me to people involved, thank you very much. Right, is there anything? If there's nothing else on that for now, I'd like to just sort of say thank you to everybody again and pass back to Glenn and Steve, I think, for an update on what's happening on enterprise zones.
Thank you, Chair. I'll introduce this item, and then I'm sure Steve will want to come in. I think we've discussed some of it, and I'm conscious of time, so I'll keep it short. The enterprise zone has continued to meet throughout the lockdown in March and June, and has been discussing some really exciting and interesting developments linked to Goon Hilly and their subsequent getting building funds, successful application, Southside development, Newquay Cornwall Airport, and also the wider flow development opportunity. We've also seen quite a lot of progress down at the Marine Hub as well, in terms of taking forward the extension there and gaining planning permission for the extension of the Marine Hub. And probably just as importantly as a piece of work, we have begun looking at free ports and whether there is a credible free port proposition from Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. At the moment, that has focused around the enterprise zone footprint, but we have gone out to tender to bring in, hopefully we're in the middle of a tender process, to bring in some expertise to analyse that against what we think the government criteria might be. The government criteria hasn't been published quite yet and is a little bit delayed, but also an analysis against other areas that are putting bids forward. That contract is likely to be a break contract, so we will do a piece of work, a phase 1 piece of work around is there a compelling case, what might that look like, what's the shape of that, and then a second part to that contract if and when the government consultation comes out and they launch the competition, which is helping us prepare and submit a bid. Probably look to award that contract in the next couple of weeks. And the only other thing I was going to raise was the investment pipeline in terms of interest being shown on the enterprise zone site. It is very strong, and if anything has been strengthened during the COVID lockdown period. We're continuing to get a strong list of inquiries, and we're working with some potential businesses that either want to expand or relocate. So some good stuff going on at the enterprise zone. Obviously, I would, in terms of the airport enterprise zone, I would echo your concern earlier, Mark. It's great to see that the council has taken steps to secure Newquay Cornwall Airport, and I think we agree that that's a really important economic asset and will be important to the recovery. But we are working with Cornwall Council and the wider business community to call for the government to step in to make sure that's not at the expense of the spaceport. That's all I was going to say. Steve may, as chair, may want to add something.
Steve? Mute. I think I'm
so a little bit to add, Glenn, but hopefully I think you've covered most of the bases there. What I was just going to pick up on was, firstly, from the airport. I was there not so long ago, just before lockdown, and what I was encouraged to hear, so having an aviation background, they are pretty diversified. So they've got a number of activities there, some of which are not sort of commercial flying related, including, for example, providing air traffic services as far afield as Wales and support to MOD stuff as well. So that gives me some comfort. But turning to, I think the area that's probably most exciting within that, I think we've talked through the use of EZ funds, and I think it was right to do it in the way that we did it, although albeit it wasn't wholly popular, I think, to say with the enterprise zone board members. But I think we've done the right thing, and I think that will probably be the end of it. For just that reason. But I wanted to really just talk about floating offshore wind, but also what it means for the enterprise zone. I talked about South West Floating Offshore Wind Accelerator. What I didn't talk about was the sale of Wave Hub. That's progressing. We're now halfway through the sales process. We've got bidders secured and about to enter what's known as the binding offers phase. And currently we're on track to have sold the project by Christmas, albeit it's an ambitious timescale. We've also secured, I think, in principle, just waiting for confirmation at the end of this next month, Section 36 consent for floating offshore wind there. So what I think that means is that with a fair wind, we will have a project developer in place by the beginning of next year, bidding into auction round 4 and starting a project which would be something the order of £150 million. And needless to say, that's a huge opportunity for Falmouth in particular, but for the region in general, and a stepping stone for us. So we've been, with that as background, the other two things that we have just been thinking about, as Glenn has said, is free ports. And what's also cropped up, and you're aware of this, I know Mark and Glenn is as well, is devolved powers. Because some of the stuff that we've been thinking about is how we might accelerate the speed with which we do offshore wind stuff. Currently, it's 8 years to consent to take a farm from planning all the way through to first power. And we think we could do that much more quickly. It requires two things. Firstly, a sort of investment in doing stuff, front-loading stuff offshore, but also probably some form of integrated or devolved powers. So we've done a little piece of work to support Jessie Harmshire, who reached out to us about anything we might want, and we'll just see where that takes us. But I think there's possibly an integration in that work of devolved powers and free ports, because we're beginning to see that we could actually do work within a free port, within the enterprise zone in Falmouth, which could have sort of significant export opportunities. So I think it's fair to say there's some quite encouraging stuff going on. I think the proof of the pudding there will be in, firstly, us getting the sale over the line so that we can start to do some of the stuff we want to do for AMP and Falmouth. And again, if we can start work on this floating offshore wind accelerator, that again will have a really good enterprise zone benefit. I think of all the enterprise zones, the Falmouth is the one that we feel hasn't moved as quickly as possible, but it's now the one that's probably as well placed as any, or better placed than almost any, to make the most of this opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. I know we've got Phil and Julian on the line, and it's just a request really that we've been talking to Jessie and Glenn to make sure that the wider devolution asks, which support the things that Steve talked about, that may support some of the tourism asks, we just want to make sure that we are properly joined up, because this is happening at such a pace. Sorry, Phil. This is happening at such a pace. We just want to make sure that we are we really asking for all the right things? Is what we're asking for the most effective means of getting to the end point on these? So it's just a request really to make sure we're as joined up as we can do. So I don't feel that, Julian, it's a bit unfair, but I don't think you want to pick up on that.
Thank you, Mark. I don't mind coming in. Yeah, I'm happy that we are joined up. The requirements in respect of the time, the incredible amount of time it would take in terms of the MMO is very complicated. So happy that we're looking at it, and agree with Steve about the time it would take and whether we can do things more efficiently. Although we know that it is very, very complicated to get a plan in place and to get those powers, but happy to work alongside you.
Yeah, there are two parts to this, Phil, as well. It's not just the MMO, it's the Crown Estate as well. And yeah, the two organisations don't really talk to each other, and they don't really know their region. So what we're looking for, whether it's the MMO and the Crown Estate sat here in a collective way with us, working together, I don't really mind. It's just doing this in a way which we can accelerate the process.
And thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mark. I think that actually that personally feels to me like the best way forward, in which we try and work really closely together to ensure that it's all joined up. So yeah, so I'd support that direction of travel, absolutely.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that, Phil. I think I'm just having a senior moment. I thought there was something else I wanted to add on enterprise zones, and there isn't. So, but thank you, Steve. Thank you, Glenn. Thanks, Phil. We're going to try. If there's any other business for this part of the meeting, if we can just take it now. I did notice in the chat box that Josie's going to pick up the Freeport consultation as an action. Gordon.
Thanks, Mark. A question about whether we are doing something, and I'm urging us that we do. So the end of October is the deadline for responses to the consultation period on the Planning for the Future white paper, changing the planning rules. And the planning rules do need changing, but it's a desperately poor paper with potentially very serious consequences for the creative sector, but also for our for town centres, for the recovery of town centres, notably around what's being said about Section 106 and permitted development rights. So I'm curious as to whether we are going to submit a response, and if we haven't thought about it yet, I'd be happy to join in on putting one together.
Then, Phil, can I ask you to respond?
Yeah, happy to give a LEP response. We're looking at it. I think we haven't come to a view about what the view of the LEP might be yet, because we're still in that phase of looking at it in some detail. What might be really helpful, Gordon, is as you've articulated, the deadline for that is clearly going to be before the next board meeting. So we might just need to delegate signing off a response to a few board members in order to make sure that that's got some traction with the board. But I'm happy to look at that, draft some key points and work with some board members in submitting a kind of response. I would quite like to keep that to the kind of very clear economic elements of it. I know it's quite a wide-ranging paper, so I wouldn't want to get drawn into all aspects of it, but I think where there are very clear economic development angles, I'm happy that we take a view, but perhaps if we could agree a couple of board members to take that forward, that would be helpful.
Glenn, if we take that off, offline and speak to individuals, and then we'll confirm back to the board who that group is. Yeah. Okay. Right. We're going to finish there because we're really conscious of time. We're going to go into our private session now, and I think the instructions, so Helen, tell me if I'm wrong, is that people stay on the line, switch their cameras and microphones off. We'll take a 5-minute comfort break, and then we'll resume why don't we resume at 5:02? Is that okay, Helen? Is that the guidance?
Okay, yes, thank you, Chairman. What I will do is now get the live stream producer to end the live streaming. And when you come back from your comfort break, I'll confirm to you that the live streaming is paused. And yes, if everyone could turn off their cameras and put themselves on mute, thank you.
That's lovely. And people come back at 5:02, that would be fantastic. Thanks for your help, Helen. See you all in a few minutes.